Hi everybody, Turkey's economy is in shambles.
Turkey is in economic turmoil. People are queuing for bread, cutting back on meat, and are even fleeing to other countries.
The Turkish lira has lost nearly half of its value this year, leaving many families struggling to cope.
Turkey's central bank has raised interest rates from 8.5% to 15%. That's almost double.
So if you see this graph, you will see that in 2014, 4 liras were equal to $1. But as of June 2023, it depreciated to 23.1 lira. And by October, it was already 28.1 lira per dollar. That's a 600% decline in just 9 years. And to make matters worse, Turkey was even hit by a massive earthquake. And if you look at this graph, the situation is so bad that inflation in Turkey peaked at 80% and now it stands at 61%. And you know what, guys? Turkey is a classic example of how politics ruined the economy of a country due to the short-term decisions of the politicians. And this case study is very important for us to learn from, because even we have our elections coming up in 2024. And just like Turkey, if our politicians start implementing people-pleasing policies, even we will be in shambles. And unfortunately, these people-pleasing policies have already started popping up.
It's a BJP versus Congress war of words over the Karnataka freebies.
कमल फूल की सरकार बना दो, माताओं, दीदियों को, बच्चियों को टिकट लेना नहीं पड़ेगा आपकी यात्रा।
3,000 रुपए हर महीने हर ग्रेजुएट को 2 साल के लिए कांग्रेस पार्टी देगी।
लोगों को अच्छा इलाज देना फ्री भी नहीं है, लोगों को अच्छा इलाज देना फ्री की रेवड़ी।
आजकल हमारे देश में मुफ्त की रेवड़ी बांटकर वोट बटोरने का कल्चर लाने की भरसक कोशिश हो रही है।
So this failure of Turkey has some very important lessons for India and every other country that's trying to revive its economy. So in this episode today, let's dig deep and understand why is Turkey in such a terrible state. What did their government fundamentally do wrong? And most importantly, what are the lessons that India and the world needs to learn from the failure of Turkey? This is a story that started in 2001. And if you remember, 2001 was the year when the dot-com bubble burst, the 9/11 attacks took place, and the entire world witnessed an economic crisis.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
We believe that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
Most of those internet companies of the dot-com era are out of business.
And during this time, just like any other country, even Turkey got affected. Its economy shrank by 9.4%, the annual inflation rate reached a staggering 68.5%, and the currency situation got so bad that $1 was equal to 1.65 million lira. So to tackle this currency crisis, the government had to wipe out 6 zeros from the old currency and introduce a new currency called the New Turkish Lira. Now, during these turbulent times, Turkey's interim president took several steps to revamp the economy. Now, if you're a thinkschool student, you already know what these standard steps are, right? So tell me, what would a country do to recover from an economic crisis? Number 1, take up more debt to fuel growth. Number 2, invite foreign investments. And number 3, develop infrastructure to invite more businesses to generate employment. This is exactly what Turkey did, and they secured an IMF bailout of $16 billion. Then, in 2003, a man named Tayyip Erdogan was elected as the president of Turkey, and in his first decade itself, the economy prospered. FDI inflows reached a record high of $22.1 billion in 2007, and if you look at this chart, the annual GDP growth rate frequently exceeded 5%. And even though it dipped in 2008 due to the economic crisis, it quickly recovered and even achieved a growth rate of 11.2% in 2011. So if you look at these numbers, everything looks great, right? So if you were a Turkish citizen and this is the result that your politicians are giving out, you would be very happy, right? Well, you know what, guys? This is where the numbers became misleading, because while the economy was growing from the outset, behind the scenes, things were getting very bad. And as an Indian citizen, this is something that even you need to understand about the economy of India. Why? I will tell you in some time. But first, let's understand Turkey's economic situation and then learn to apply it to India. So in Turkey, while the GDP was growing at an unbelievable pace, two significant problems were silently shaping up in its backyard. One was the rising current account deficit and the second was the depreciating lira. So let's do a quick revision as to what is current account balance and then we'll move on with the story. Current account balance is basically the total export of goods and services minus total import of goods and services plus net inflows of payments. Now this inflow could be export payments and outflow could be import payments. So let's say a country does an export of $50 billion worth of goods and $30 billion worth of services. It imports $100 billion worth of products and $40 billion worth in services. And lastly, it receives $10 billion in foreign income and gives out $5 billion in remittance. So if these are the numbers, how would you calculate the current account balance? It would be 50 minus $100 billion plus 30 minus $40 billion plus 10 minus $5 billion. So it's minus $50 billion minus $10 billion plus $5 billion equal to minus $55 billion. So the current account deficit is $55 billion. Now is this good? Well, not at all. Why? Because it indicates that $55 billion are moving out of the country every year, which is not good at all. Now in case of Turkiye, if you look at their current account deficit, this is what it looked like. As the economy started growing after 2001, the deficit also started to pile up. It went from 20 billion to 40 billion to 70 billion in 2011. Secondly, if you look at the value of the currency, even that started dipping rapidly. This was because the nation was consuming a lot more from imports than it was exporting. If you see, it went from 5 lira to the dollar to more than 20 lira in just 4 years. And this is what started a vicious cycle, wherein as the imports increased, import bills increased. So to pay for these imports, the need for foreign currency or US dollar increased. And since they did not have enough money, Turkey borrowed money to pay. And when they borrowed money, the debt started to increase. And to pay off these debts, what did Turkey do? They committed the grave mistake of economic revival, which is printing money. And when they printed more money, inflation spiked and the currency depreciated. And this further increased import bills, starting a tricky cycle of money troubles. So if you look at this chart, ever since Turkey started printing money, Turkey's external debt shot up from 38% of its GDP in 2011 to 54% of its GDP in 2019. And if you look at their foreign reserves, it dropped from nearly $110 billion to just over $60 billion from 2014 to 2019. And just as they were struggling with their finances, they were hit by another wave of troubles in the form of COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war.
Russia's military invasion of Ukraine has not only created one of the world's most tragic humanitarian crises, but resulted in economic devastation that will reverberate far beyond Ukraine's borders.
40% of Turkey's gas, almost 80% of its wheat imports come from Russia. There are more Russian tourists here than from any other country. Turkey therefore fears economic repercussions.
And then the situation only got worse. Now you tell me guys, when the Russia-Ukraine war happened, why did inflation happen all across the world? It was because of the increase in oil prices. So any country that was energy dependent on foreign countries witnessed inflation. In case of Turkey, they imported more than 80% of their energy needs. So if you look at this chart, as the oil price increased, Turkey's inflation increased along with the prices simultaneously. This is how, due to its current account deficit, money printing and inflation, combined with COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war, Turkey spiraled into a grave economic crisis. But you know what guys, the story does not end here. In fact, here's where it gets super interesting. Because Turkey responded to the situation in the most insane way. And this reaction taught the world a very, very important lesson in economics. So the question is, what did Turkey do? Turns out, Turkey did the complete opposite of what governments usually do to control inflation. Now again, if you're a thinkschool student, you already know what a country does when inflation arises, right? So tell me, what will a country do when inflation increases? The country's central bank would increase the interest rates. For example, in India, when inflation spiked, what did RBI do? RBI increased the repo rate.
India's central bank, RBI, has raised key repo rate by 35 basis points.
India also has suffered a hit to its economy thanks to high inflation and rising interest rate.
Now for those who don't know, this is nothing but the interest at which RBI lends money to banks like HDFC. So when the repo rate increases, it means that RBI is increasing the interest at which it lends money to banks like HDFC. So what happened when repo rate increased? The home loan EMI and the corporate loan EMI increased all across the country. And because of this, people and businesses both had less money to spend. So when people had less money to spend, automatically the cost of goods decreased and hence inflation was controlled. For example, last time when the RBI increased the repo rate, the home loan EMIs of all Indians increased. So if your home loan EMI increased by 10,000 rupees, you will have 10,000 rupees less to spend, right? And because of this, you won't be able to go and watch a lot of movies. As a result, the demand for movie tickets will go down, because of which the theatres will decrease the cost of movie tickets. So eventually, the cost of the movie ticket decreases. So just like the theatres decrease the cost of movie tickets, sellers from all across the country will decrease their prices. Eventually, inflation will be controlled. So just like the theatres decrease the cost of the movie tickets because people had less money, sellers from all across the country would decrease their price of the products because people have less money to spend. And when this cost decreases, eventually inflation is controlled. This is like the standard method of controlling inflation. But you know what Erdogan did? He did the complete opposite. During the period when inflation was high, instead of increasing the interest rates, he decreased the interest rates from around 19% in 2021 to below 10% in 2023. So the question is, what is this madness? Why would the president of a struggling country go against the norms of economics? Very simple. Elections, elections, and elections.
The White House is watching the presidential election in Turkey, which could have a big impact on the U.S. and its NATO allies.
The AKP, which went on to win a landslide victory in the 2002 elections, and he became Prime Minister of Turkey.
Erdogan has kicked off his election campaign with a rally in Ankara. Speaking in front of 40,000 supporters, Erdogan pledged to rein in inflation and boost economic growth.
Now you see, whenever interest rates are hiked, just like we saw in the home loan example, the common man's expense increases due to increased EMI, and the businesses face a cash crunch because they cannot borrow money at low interest. So even though increasing interest rate is a necessary step to curb inflation, it was not people-pleasing enough to implement. And this was also because Turkey was hit by a massive earthquake which led to an economic disaster in the country. So during this time, you tell me, will you vote for a government that increases your EMI? No, right? So the president of Turkey very happily chose to please the people instead of respecting the rules of economics. And as expected, when the interest rates decreased, the inflation rate further went from around 20% to more than 80%. And the Lira further depreciated to 28 Lira per US dollar. So because of this people-pleasing policy, in 2023, Erdogan happily got elected as the president of Turkey again. But you know what happened after the elections? When inflation got out of control, the same Erdogan who decreased the interest rates while the inflation was increasing, the same guy suddenly increased the interest rates from 8.5% to 15% to 30%, and now it stands at 35%.
For the first time in almost 2.5 years, Turkey's central bank has raised interest rates to 15% from just under 9%.
Turkey's central bank delivered a large interest rate hike on Thursday.
The size of the rate hike was not expected, although the direction was expected.
To give you a context of how crazy this situation is, if you look at these charts, if you took out a loan of 50 lakhs at 6.6% per annum over 20 years, a mere 1.4% increase in interest rates can increase your bank EMI by 11%, from 37,574 rupees to 41,822 rupees. So if 1.4% can cause such a drastic increase, can you imagine what a 26.5% increase in interest rates can do to people like you and me? It would be absolutely crazy. This is what happened due to the sudden increase in interest rates in Turkey. So now, after this sudden spike, inflation in Turkey has come down from 80% to 40%. So what does this teach you? If you don't respect the role of economics in politics and prioritize your short-term political goals instead of the long-term interest of the economy, you will have a crisis in your country within no time. This is the story of the economic crisis of Turkey. And this brings us to the last and perhaps the most important part of the episode, and that are the lessons that India and the world need to learn from this entire crisis of Turkey. Now people, if you look at India's condition, we have a very similar situation to that of Turkey. It's just that we reacted differently to our situations. We have a very high current account deficit just like Turkey. But if you look at this chart, we have decreased our deficit from $22 billion in Q3 of 2022 to $18.2 billion in Q3 of 2023. Just like Turkey, even India was affected by the Russia-Ukraine war. But instead of decreasing the interest rates to please the people, we increased the interest rates, which caused difficulty to the people of India, but eventually inflation came under control. And lastly, just like Turkey, even we import more than 80% of our energy requirement. So every time oil price increases, inflation happens in India. But unlike Turkey, we are working towards renewable energy and we are building the infrastructure to become less dependent on oil. So overall, India has taken long-term decisions without putting its economy at risk. But you know what? As the general elections are drawing closer, political parties will ignore the rules of economics to win vote banks. So as informed citizens of this country, we need to keep an eye on the situation. So if you want to be the informed citizens of this country, here are the top 3 lessons that we need to learn from Turkey's economic crisis. Lesson number 1. We should not solely rely on GDP as an economic metric, and it's essential to consider other parameters like fiscal deficit, interest to revenue receipts and import deficit to have a better perspective of how India is actually performing. So if India's GDP is 3.5 trillion with a 9.1% annual growth rate in 2022, this stat alone does not give a complete reflection of the economic condition. Our fiscal deficit is 6.4% as opposed to an ideal 3 to 5%. Our import deficit is $266 billion in FY23, which is a $75 billion jump from $191.05 billion in the previous fiscal year. So you see, together these stats illustrate a more holistic perspective of our current economic condition. So don't be misled by the GDP headlines. Secondly, the one question that we need to ask our politicians every quarter is, what are we doing to increase our exports? Because if you look at Turkey, they spiraled into an economic crisis because they were too import dependent. So the question is, what are we doing to compete with legends like China? And lastly, like I said, elections are coming close, and during these times, more often than not, politics is prioritized over economics. So politicians will resort to people-pleasing policies which may get them the votes now, but in the long run, it will come at the expense of the nation's economy. Because you see, majority of our voters do not understand economics. So when politicians come up with policies that talk about giving freebies, it excites people in the short term, but it kills our economy in the long run. For example, in 2004, Atal Bihari Vajpayee came out with a visionary policy of the new pension scheme because the old pension scheme was draining our economy. But today, 20 years later, several states of India are fighting over reversing it, which is bound to cause an economic crisis, but will get them the vote bank of the pensioners. So long story short, politics should never ever triumph over economy. If it does, that nation is bound to go bankrupt. This is the message that the Turkish economic crisis has for India and the world itself. And I just hope you learned something valuable from this case study. That's all from my side for today, guys. If you learned something valuable, please make sure to hit the like button in order to make YouTube happy. And for more such insightful business and political case studies, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.